Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We already have a question in the question box. Although I want to make sure, can you all hear me? Please say, somebody please say yes in the question box if you can hear me. Yes, okay, great, thank you. I'm doing this on my own today, so please be forgiving of my lack of skill with GoToWebinar. I've been spending the last hour and a half figuring out how to do this without Angie. But I'm sure you'll all be happy to hear that Angie had her daughter 2 weeks ago. Her name is Maple, like maple syrup, and she's just as sweet. And lucky me, I needed a little bit of help getting the webinar set up, so I got to get a little view of baby Maple sleeping, and she's just incredibly adorable. So in this time where a lot of things are very difficult, I think it's really nice to be able to see that there are happy things to celebrate, things like new babies. Yeah, we need to have some hope. And so, oh, and Chaz is asking, do I have a screenshot of Maple to share? Because he'd love to see a new baby. I'm sorry, I didn't get a screenshot. I can tell you what she looks like. She's small and her face is red. And she looks like a baby. I'm sorry, now I'm getting a sad face from Chaz. But yeah, so I guess we're starting. Again, welcome everybody. Nice to see you, at least in the question box. And here we are to talk about adaptation plans, part 1. And we will have a guest speaker a little bit later in the webinar for about the second half today. It's going to be Josh Simmons, who is also a part of Prosper Sustainably with Angie, and he is going to talk with us about one adaptation strategy, which is the use of microgrids. And a lot of tribes have started to use microgrids in concert with their solar panel and other renewable energy installations. And so a microgrid is a good adaptation strategy that we're going to hear a little bit more about. So before we jump in to start talking about the first part of adaptation plans, I mentioned in my email yesterday that we are in a really tense and anxious and difficult time in the United States right now, not only with the pandemic, but what's happening with communities of color, the Black community in particular, but all communities of color, the Black, Indigenous, people of color, that's the acronym BIPOC, are dealing with issues that maybe for somebody like me who is not Indigenous or a person of color, I'm white, is easy for us to not think about when we don't have to deal with these sorts of issues in our daily lives. But I know a lot of you are dealing with these kinds of issues on a regular basis. And I just want to acknowledge that just because there are now protests and a lot of energy and focus being put on these issues doesn't mean that they're new. This is something that has been a part of the United States since the colonizers first arrived, since the first enslaved people were brought here in 1619. So we've got a 401-year history of systemic inequalities and the legacy of colonialism in this country. So I just want to make space for that. If you feel like you have anything you want to say or share about your experience, feel free to just put a comment or anything you like in the question box. But and I can share those with others. But I do feel like it's important for us to acknowledge what's going on in the country and in the world. But that being said, the work that we are doing, that we are continuing with part 6 today of our webinar series with adaptation planning, it does involve all of those things that I just talked about, the legacy of colonialism and systemic racism and inequality in this country, because I believe that we cannot adapt and we cannot fix the problem of climate change if we don't first fix the problems of systemic inequality in this nation and in the world. So maybe that becomes a part of what we do in our adaptation strategies, is not just how do we adapt to wildfire and drought and flooding and sea level rise and ice melt, but how do we not just adapt but mitigate the impact of a colonial system and an unequal system that has led us to this place where we are using the earth in a way that we can't sustain. We have to fix them both at the same time. So again, I could be on a soapbox about this for the whole time. I don't want to do that. But if you have any comments or questions along those lines, anything you'd like to share, please do go ahead and do so. All right, so let's move into our actual topic today. So we are talking about, hold on while I move my screen so I can see what I'm looking at. So since our last webinar, we did have a suggested reading, and I did put that back out yesterday for you all to take a look at. And hopefully you got an opportunity to look at the Oregon Climate and Health Resilience Plans Executive Summary. Just one slide, and we're showing it up on the screen right now, so you can even scan it while we're talking about it. And if you have any comments on that, please go ahead and, again, put those into that question box. Is there anything in here that surprises you? Is there anything that resonated in particular with you? Or is it familiar? Does your state already have some sort of climate adaptation plan or some sort of climate resilience plan? So that's a simple question, even if the answer is just yes or no, or I don't know. Go ahead and throw that into the question box and say, you know, I'm from this state, and yes, we do, or no, we don't have any sort of adaptation plan for our state. And that way we get an idea of what's happening in the rest of the country. And Paula says she's not sure if Oklahoma has an adaptation plan or not. Anne says no. Anne, which state are you in that does not have a plan? California has a plan. Obviously, Oregon has a plan. So looking at this executive summary, it ties in with some very, not specific exactly, but some issues that Oregon has decided that they want to focus on very specifically. So they are looking at workforce capacity, they're looking at policies, systems, and environments. So this is the way that Oregon has chosen to frame their adaptation plan, that they have some very specific ideas about what they want to do as far as their capacity as a state to promote these long-term changes. How is this having an impact on their public health and their workforce? And what can they do to collaborate in health departments? What can they do to enact policies with their diverse partners? And an important thing here, elevating the voices of our most vulnerable populations is really important. You know, and obviously there are tribal voices in Oregon, but there are other communities as well. All of these things that can affect the entire state, things like air quality and local food systems. So they have a policy portion. Their system portion, let's look at what the systems involve. Do we have monitoring, or can we get monitoring in place of our climate and health indicators so we can monitor our progress of our systemic changes towards climate adaptation? And equipping healthcare partners, that's key. You've got to have your health partners involved, especially if you're going to include health. And of course, you should include health in your climate adaptation planning. And then the environments. What environments are we dealing with? You know, for an entire state like Oregon, they have what most people think of when they think of Oregon, you know, the forests and the coasts and the rivers, but Eastern Oregon is more of a desert environment. So you have to consider the changes in the different parts of the state and what they might be most suited for, what kinds of adaptation strategies. And then, of course, environments can also include and need to include social environments, community environments. So these are all really important things. Now, some of you put a few things into the question box, so thank you. Michelle says that apparently Minnesota does not have a plan for the state. Let me see. So I'm doing double duty now. Usually Angie does the talking and I do the questions. I'm doing both. Paula says she's not sure about South Dakota. Anne says that Alaska is working on theirs, which is great. Alaska is on the front lines of climate change, so that's good to know. Aaron has a comment. He says, thank you for making the acknowledgements. I'm assuming of climate inequities. We've had internal discussions regarding climate and equity and how to get frontline communities at the table of voicing environmental trends that affect their home, neighbors, and neighborhood. So yeah, thank you for that, Aaron. It's very important. Shannon Seneca says she had no idea about her state's adaptation plan until I asked. And she says that New York does have some work under the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then Lori says she's been surprised at the impact of the Trump administration that it's had on both, and this is for California, both our policy and on the severity of climate change. I agree with what her next sentence is. I was ignorant and had no idea how quickly the feds could destroy progress. And Michelle comes back and says that Minnesota actually has a climate and health strategic plan that was updated in 2019. And from Stefan, Colorado has a climate plan. So great. Thank you so much, everybody, for commenting on what's going on in your state. All right, so looking at this Oregon executive summary, we might be thinking about how these sorts of summaries could work in our own communities, or what sorts of summaries we might apply to the work that we're doing. So let's take a look at actual adaptation planning. For the last two webinars, we have talked about vulnerability assessments, and that's what you have to do first. You have to look at the vulnerabilities in your community so that you can identify the things that you want to address in your adaptation plan. And obviously, you want to be able to minimize the adverse impacts of those climate exposures. You want to minimize your vulnerabilities. So here we have this graphic showing all sorts of circling and intertwined different parts of our adaptation planning and our vulnerability assessment. So what are we centering in this graphic? Obviously, we're centering health. We have our physical health, including things like illness, injury, death, obviously as a consequence of those two things. Undernutrition, limited access to health services, all part of physical health, but I think that overlaps significantly with mental health in the center here. And we've already seen increased conflict and aggression as a result of climate impacts, obviously with trauma, stress, and anxiety, bringing along feelings of grief and helplessness. But a lot of time when people feel trauma, when they feel stress, it does result in increased conflict. And sadly, there seems to be a correlation during this pandemic that because people are cooped up and they're sheltering in place, there's been an increase in domestic violence incidences. So that these are things that overlap. If your mental health and your physical health are both not good, then they can both end up making each other worse. Let's intertwine that with our socioeconomic health and our cultural and spiritual health. Now, obviously, again, the pandemic is a great example, even though it's not directly linked with climate change. What are the costs of lost work, What are the costs of changes in job availability or lost school days? This is all part of our socioeconomic health. And again, it increases our stress, and stress increases the likelihood of physical health consequences. And then finally, tie it all together with our cultural and spiritual health. We have all sorts of disruptions of tradition. In fact, again, I know the pandemic is not specifically climate related, but if there were something like a wildfire or some other climate related weather incident that caused you to not be able to leave your home, or that caused a disruption in some sort of a cultural or spiritual tradition, that's something that's going to have a big impact, not just on individuals, but on the community. So if any of you have experienced those sorts of disruptions during the pandemic, maybe you can share them with us in the question box. For Paula, we ended up having to cancel our annual Coupa Days ceremony or celebration, which happens the first weekend of May every month. It commemorates the anniversary of the Cupeño people's removal from their traditional home in Warner Springs. And so that's huge. Coupa Day started in 1974 as an official commemoration, and it's the first time ever. So the first time in, let me do the math, 46 years that Coupa Days has had to be canceled, and that creates a lot of stress. So, circling around, we have these other more climate related impacts, the air quality, vector changes, food security, water, and then surrounding all that are main drivers of climate change, or not the drivers of climate change, but the exposures, the main exposures: drought, storms and flooding, temperature, melting ice, sea level rise, and wildfire. So we bring all these circles together, and we want to get to the impacts in the center. How can our adaptation planning reduce the impact, the health impact of those exposures and the secondary exposures that we are experiencing in our communities? So that leads me to a poll. I want to get you guys having a little bit of input here. So I'm going to launch this poll. Hopefully it shows up. And we're going to be asking, to what extent do you feel that your community is prepared for or adapted to these types of health impacts? So our choices, we have very, we have taken many actions to address specific impacts. We have moderately, we have taken some action on major impacts. And we have not prepared or adapted, we are still identifying our impacts. Okay, so we've got about half of you who have voted. So I know I would be remiss if I did not bring in our friend the screaming goat. So there you go. There's your signal to go ahead and vote in the poll. All right, pretty good. We're up to 78%. I might have to give one more scream to see if we can get up into the 80s. One more. Uh-oh, it looks like a few people the poll is not letting them click. All right, well, we've had a minute, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now I will share the results. All right, so I'm actually really excited that even though it's a small amount, we have 3% of people who have said very, that you've taken a lot of actions to address specific impacts. So if you answered very, I would love to hear what you've done, because maybe there's some things that you've done that I haven't, and for all of us, we'd love to hear that. So what have you done to address some specific impacts? And then we've got a even split, 48% for each of moderately and not prepared. So about half of you have taken some actions, and then the other half have taken or have not prepared much yet, and are still identifying your vulnerabilities. That's great. That's fine. That's why you are here, right? If you'd already done everything, then you would be the ones giving this webinar instead of me. So, all right, thank you for that. Let's move on to our next slide. And let me shut the poll. Let's see. Hide. All right, so adaptation planning. Yes, this is quite a big process, but if you've started your vulnerability assessment, then you are already well on your way to adaptation planning. And actually, these things can go hand in hand as you are addressing your vulnerabilities. You can also be coming up with potential solutions or strategies that you can put into your adaptation plan. And this is a constant cycle. You don't just do your vulnerability assessment once and then put everything into the adaptation plan and say, okay, that's it. We've done everything we need to do. We're done. So you see here, we have a cycle of what's going on. We evaluate, we update, we adopt, we implement, and continue to cycle through those different roles, those different actions in your adaptation plan. The last thing we want is for this adaptation plan to be one of those reports that you write and then stick into a 3-ring binder and put up on the shelf. You should be continuously evaluating, updating, and then readopting every couple of years. You take that back to your tribal council, to your community, because as we know, things change. A lot of us are now including pandemic planning as part of our adaptation plans. Even though I keep saying this pandemic is not directly climate related, there may be future pandemics that are. And it's basically a disaster. And so disaster planning is part of our adaptation planning. But you'll be happy to know there are a lot of strategies out there that help us with the vulnerabilities we've identified and that we can put into our adaptation plan. A lot of things that will help us to limit those exposures and adapt to the impacts. And so when you've identified your most serious vulnerabilities, that's when you start to brainstorm solutions. So again, you're wanting to mitigate, you want to reduce, or you want to eliminate the vulnerability to those problems that you've identified in your vulnerability assessment. You can rank your vulnerabilities so that way you can address the most serious of your vulnerabilities right off the bat. It may be that you have some vulnerabilities that overlap. Storms and flooding may ultimately overlap with wildfire adaptation, because wildfire will burn off all the vegetation on a hillside, which makes it a potential threat for future mudslides. So that those two things combined might be one of your biggest vulnerabilities. But even though there are so many vulnerabilities out there, generally we can put them into large categories, and then we can develop solutions within those categories to help us decide what are we going to focus on, what are the strategies that we need. Now, because we've been focusing on health in our adaptation planning and our vulnerability assessments, you definitely want to focus on those in your adaptation plan as well. It is not the best idea to have an adaptation plan that doesn't consider all of those things we talked about in the previous slide, those mental and physical and cultural and spiritual and socioeconomic vulnerabilities that we face. All of those end up having an impact on human health. So we want to make absolutely sure that we are including those things in our adaptation plan. You can have them as part of the adaptation plan as a chapter, or it's also possible, or I mean, it depends on what's best for your community. You can have a community health adaptation plan or a community health improvement plan that is separate from your overall adaptation plan. But what the research finds is that planning for health impacts is really positive for the overall health of a community, and especially in terms of the social positives. So people end up having increased mental health or improved mental health. And if we improve our physical activity, our social connectivity, all of those things end up being part of our adaptation plan. If our community is resilient in its mental, emotional, spiritual, cultural, and physical health, then it helps us to adapt to those challenges that we're facing with climate change. All of them are intertwined and very important. So within the Tribal Climate Health Project framework, we have developed some tools And those tools are available for you on the Tribal Climate Health Project website. So we're going to talk about a couple of the steps. Now, again, we've got a cycle here of the same things. We've got our vulnerability assessment, adaptation plan with our evaluate, update, adopt, and implement cycle. But since we're starting fresh, or at least a lot of you are starting fresh on this, then there are some things that you need to consider. And it's step number 1, which I have not highlighted here, but it goes back to the reading that we had suggested, the Oregon framework, the executive summary. You want to determine your objectives, determine your scope, and that will help you to decide what your priorities are going to be. Now, for me, when I'm talking about objectives and scope, like when the question came to me for Paula's adaptation strategy, what is your objective? And, you know, kind of tongue in cheek, but not really, my answer was, well, my objective is to save the world. You know, I just want Paula to be a climate perfect place. I don't want there to be any climate impacts that we haven't adapted to and planned for. Well, obviously, that's a little pie in the sky to say that we're going to save the world with our adaptation plan. So I had to narrow it down just a little bit. But if you don't have objectives and you don't have a scope, then that's going to make it harder for you to determine what you want to include ultimately in your adaptation plan. So spend some time on that, thinking about what your objectives are. And then as far as scope, do you want the scope to initially start with, say, doing adaptation planning for tribal government facilities? Do you want your scope to include your education department? Do you want your scope to be included in, say, if you have economic development operations, if you have a casino, if you have agriculture, any other economic development, is it going to be included in that scope? And ultimately, all those things should be included. But when you're starting, you might just decide, all right, first we're going to deal with the immediate needs of our tribal community. And then we'll expand out to include the casino. And then perhaps from there, we'll expand out to include neighboring communities. There's a lot of different ways to define your scope. Now I have an arrow on here that goes to a resolution template, or it goes from resolution template to the objectives and scope. So all of you obviously have different criteria in your tribal governments for what kind of oversight your leadership wants to have. But it helps to have a tribal resolution to support the work that you're doing so that you know you have leadership behind you. If you need a template for beginning your work on your adaptation plan, if you need a resolution template, we have one on our website. It actually came from the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. So that's a tool that you can use. Now, the two steps we have highlighted we're really focusing on today, because we'll be doing adaptation strategies for our next webinar as well. So once you've just determined your objectives and scope, you want to put together your long list of adaptation strategies. So again, we have some tools to help you with that as well. On the Tribal Climate Health Project website, we have a resource clearinghouse. And we, of course, also have the EASY tool, which we talked about at our last webinar. So if you're not already using the EASY tool, this is a time to start using it. And I'll show a screenshot of that in a few slides, but I don't want to do that just yet. But you can look at the Resource Clearinghouse. You can find other tribes' adaptation plans in the Resource Clearinghouse. And you can narrow down your search in the clearinghouse by area, by type of document. There's a lot of ways to narrow your search. So you might find an adaptation plan for a tribe that's within the same geographic region as you and facing some of the same potential impacts. So if that's the case, then that would be a very helpful thing to look at what some other tribes and other communities have done, and that can help you develop your own list of adaptation strategies. Then same thing with the EASY tool. If you're using that, you're putting in your vulnerabilities in there. Then you can look at those vulnerabilities, and there are suggested adaptation strategies for those vulnerabilities. You can start to highlight some of those and decide, here are some things that we think might work. Now, when I did this for Paula, you guys, I was literally highlighting like every single thing in the EASY tool. I ended up with this list that was, probably 80 adaptation strategies long, and it felt really overwhelming. That's why this is the long list. It's like the brainstorm. Everything is on the table. There's nothing that you have to say no to when you're developing your long list, even if it's something that sounds really crazy, like our adaptation strategies for high heat days is to get brand new air conditioning for every single home on the reservation, even though we have 10,000 homes. Go ahead, brainstorm. Think about stuff that is your perfect world solution. Go ahead and put those on your long list of adaptation strategies. And I would also suggest don't do this alone. It's a good idea to have somebody, at least on your staff, or a couple of people, kind of inputting their ideas into what should be on your long list. And then once you've got your long list, you're starting to feel kind of overwhelmed, then you go down to step 3. This is where you evaluate and prioritize and pull out of your long list the short list of strategies that you think you may actually be able to put on the list and start to achieve as you begin some of your adaptation implementation. So you don't have to do everything. And again, in the easy tool, you can create lists and columns. Here's our long list, and then here's what ends up in the short list. Even if you only choose one thing per exposure, that's a start. So you can curate that. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Maybe it's like when your kid gives you their long list of what they want for their birthday or what they want for Christmas. You know right away that you can take pony off the list. They're not getting a pony for Christmas. But maybe you can include, oh shoot, I don't have kids, so I don't know what they want. You can include a jumping rope. There you go. That's not a pony, but you know what? It's going to make the short list. All right. So as you're moving along with this adaptation plan, so we are determining our objectives and our scope. So I've already talked a lot about this on the previous slide. Again, considering a resolution is a good thing to do so that you have that buy-in from your leadership. That's really important. Make sure that you have different partners involved. So you may have these goals. These are some samples. These are actually what came from our adaptation strategy here in Paula. And feel free to borrow these if they resonate with you. Become a more adaptive community that can remain resilient and independent in the face of climate change impacts to Paula's health, social, natural, and built environments within the reservation, and etc. I won't read those all to you. But a vision statement is another good place to start. You can even put your vision statement in your tribal resolution if you wanted to. Now, bearing in mind this idea about changing course, are there new people involved in this? We all have tribal elections on a yearly or every couple of year basis. So maybe there's new leadership that needs to have some buy-in on this. Maybe you have new staff. Maybe there's another department that really wants to be involved in your climate change planning. And maybe you want to take a different approach. Things that haven't worked in the past, you want to reassess and try to do some things differently. Again, setting your parameters, it's just helpful if you can organize your thoughts and give yourself a list of strategies and actions to take as you start to develop your assessment. If it's just this big giant ball with no organization, it's going to feel really, really overwhelming. I don't know if any of you are athletes, but I used to do triathlons a long time ago. It's been like 10 years now. But I would have to set parameters for my training. What is my goal? How far am I going to go? Is it going to be a long race, a short race? And what's my time frame for training? What's my boundary in terms of what my goals are for how long I want to take? And I'll be honest, my goals in triathlons were always just finish the triathlon. I didn't care how long it took. And I could continue the analogy, but I think you get the idea. Set those parameters to help keep you focused. So the potential of using the resource clearinghouse that we have at the Tribal Climate Health Project website. I mentioned the tribal resolution template from ITEP. So circled on here, And again, I've sent you that web link before, but I will send it to you at the close of the webinar. But this is found under training materials, so it's a good template for you to use. All right, so now we have step 2 is our adaptation planning. So this is our long list that I just talked about. And we have this graphic here that gives you some ideas of different overlaps with different agencies or different departments, and the different types of information that you can use to help compile your long list. And one thing you might be surprised to discover, or happy to discover, is that you are actually already doing some of these things. So identify those existing actions. Maybe think about ways that you can expand on those existing actions, and think about researching more actions. And this is, again, where it can be really helpful to look at other tribes' adaptation plans. And I know I said try to find some that are close to your area geographically, but don't limit yourself to that. You might find some strategies in places that are very different from where you are, but that still resonate with your community, or that you can adapt to your community. Brainstorming is always great. If you have any sort of social media that your community is involved with, you can even throw it out there on Facebook. Hey, we're doing our adaptation plan. We'd love your ideas for what you would like to see Paula doing in our adaptation plan. If you're out at community events, same thing. You can do surveys, set up a laptop where people can do them that way instead of having to write on paper. There's a lot of different ways to get the community involved in brainstorming your actions. And if anybody has any ideas about this, feel free to throw something into the question box and I will share it with the rest of the group. And that's actually was our group discussion question for this, which is, what types of adaptation actions has your tribe already taken? So if there's something you're already doing, please, please, please go ahead and put that in the box, because I love to share what other people are doing. It's really important. All right. And here's our screenshot of the Easy tool. So again, this is Angie's brainchild, and she is much more adept at using it than I am. But you can see here that this screenshot is showing some adaptation strategy options. And some of these options are going to be relevant to more than one exposure. So you see over there, we have the primary exposure on the left, the secondary exposure, the impact type. So, and that very first one, all the way across the top, every single thing, every single exposure, primary, secondary, and impact is checked for this adaptation strategy option, which is form an intertribal emergency consortium to assist each other during disasters. If you're already a member of an intertribal consortium for disaster response, then give yourself a hand, because you already have an adaptation strategy in place. Now, Paula has put a comment in the box, and she says, I'm not sure if this is part of the plan, but our tribe has a storm shelter program. Paula, yay, I'm standing up and clapping for you, because that is absolutely an adaptation strategy, a storm sheltering program. So the Easy tool has a lot of different strategy options in here that, like I said, they cover a whole bunch of different areas. In some cases, every strategy and exposure, or I'm sorry, every exposure and impact type might be covered by a very broad adaptation strategy. Paula says that the Choctaw Nation also has a medical reserve corps. So that's, yeah, absolutely key. If you have a fire department or medical providers, if you have a health clinic, you should absolutely be including them in your adaptation strategy planning, because they'll probably have things in place already that you can include in your plan. So again, I really suggest that you play with this Easy tool and put in your own vulnerabilities and choose your own exposures so that you can use it to start developing your own plans. Let's see. Oh, for some reason, it's not wanting to move to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here are some tribal examples of some health adaptation strategies, and these are all linked. So you can't obviously click on the screen right now, but they are linked through the Tribal Climate Health Project website. So there are some that we have called out as highlights, and temperature extremes is a big deal here in the Southwest. So the Mescalero Apache, they've developed these hoop houses and greenhouses and solar power to protect food crops. And it's actually quite amazing what they've done with those hoop houses, which they've turned into greenhouses for growing food. And the Mashpee Wampanoag, not in the desert Southwest, but it still gets hot or really cold in Massachusetts. So they're providing real-time heat warnings. And again, I could read all the way down the slides here, but I don't want to do that. You guys can read. But there are really some wonderful, wonderful ideas that so many tribes have already developed that will be so helpful for you as you develop your strategies. And, you know, for Alaska, developing their own climate adaptation plan as a state, they could learn a lot from the tribes that have adaptation plans for melting ice and sea level rise. And they're actually a good example there on the bottom. So Wainwright, Alaska, they have location devices for hunters and travelers. So that is very specific. If you're worried about your hunters going out and perhaps, I don't know, I'm not in Alaska, so if anybody is from Alaska, maybe you can tell me what the dangers might be. But I'm thinking of things like a hunter goes out and maybe the ice is thinner than they're accustomed to it being. And so they get into trouble because of that. You know, maybe there's a break in the ice and they get stranded. So if you've got a location device, then you can find your lost hunter or your traveler, because you would think, what does that have to do with sea level rise? What does that have to do with climate change? Oh, and I guess I was right, because Stefan just said, yes, exactly is what happens in Alaska. I don't want to say I'm happy about that because that sounds terrifying, but I'm at least glad that I was right. So you're going to have some stuff that's very specific that may not be relevant to you, but even that Wainwright, Alaska thing, maybe you have hunters and you're not worried about them being stranded on broken ice, but there's some other issue with, say, a change in the way a river has flowed because of a flood that might make it more dangerous for hunters. So think and brainstorm and be open-minded about the way other tribes have adapted and how those strategies might actually work for you as well. All right, so we're about halfway through our time, and so I am at this point ready to introduce our guest speaker. So let me move our slides ahead. Make sure that he's actually on.
I'm here, Shasta.
You're here. Okay, terrific. Josh, were you going to share your webcam, or are you going to stay?
Yeah, I'll do my webcam, and
Okay.
my hair is less crazy than this morning.
Yeah, so Josh has quarantine hair, like so many of us do.
Yeah.
So, oh, no, that's better. So everybody, I'm pleased to welcome Josh Simmons to the webinar, and we were talking about some very specific types of adaptation strategies, and he's going to talk about one for us today that he's done a lot of work on. Real quick before I let him start, though, we have a couple more comments in the question box. Stefan mentioning Alaska, that there's thinner ice, increased riverine erosion, and a decrease in sea ice. And then Aaron Shu talks about the Chugach Regional Resources Commission. They're setting up a harmful algal bloom and a paralytic shellfish poisoning monitoring system to help protect subsistence harvesters. So algal blooms are something that happen in coastal regions, but I believe they happen in lakes as well. So even if you're not on the coast, that might be something that's relevant to your community. So thank you guys so much for sharing. Again, this is Josh Simmons from Prosper Sustainably, and I'm going to let him take it away. Do you want me to do the slides, Josh, or do you want me to give you control?
I'll probably have to pull up the slides myself if I did that right. Try giving me control and see what happens.
Let's see, change presenter. Okay, I just gave you control.
Which screen am I showing?
You are showing your email.
Just a single email?
Yeah.
No, it's background? Okay, well, I saw one request in there to see baby Maple, and so for those of you who don't know, Angie's my wife, and this is her beginning a sneeze. I shared these with Shasta yesterday. So funny little sequence. That one's considerably cuter. So she's 2 weeks old today, and there's her dancing. And here's her with her big brother Lincoln, who is just the sweetest brother you could ever hope for.
Oh, you're getting a thumbs up from Chaz, and Anne says adorable. Congratulations to both of you. And Stephanie says, oh my goodness, congrats. Oh, everybody's so excited. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Actually, Shasta, since I'm going to have to pull up the slides and I don't know where they're at, why don't you just take the presenter role and then I'll just say next slide.
Okay. All right. Let me change it back to me then. All right.
All right, thanks everybody. So yeah, there's a lot of people on today. It's great to be here. Angie's on maternity leave. I had a briefer paternity leave, and happy to be here and sharing a bit of the work that I've been doing with tribes, primarily in California, but across the country as well. And certainly this is a relevant topic. I've been working on several microgrid projects, and an important precursor to microgrid projects is adaptation planning, doing your vulnerability assessments and identifying which strategy is going to be most effective. And so without further ado, next slide. So there's me with a slightly better haircut, a little more pre-COVID, and my contact information as well. And so I've founded Prosper Sustainably in 2014, and we do climate, energy, sustainability, environmental work for tribes across the country, and we're based in California. Next slide. So just talk about the topics we'll be covering today. I'm going to give an overview of how to plan a microgrid project, go through some basics of what a microgrid system is, provide some examples of threats, impacts, and strategies, which is part of the vulnerability and adaptation planning processes that you've been discussing so far. Talk about why you may need a microgrid, or if you actually need a microgrid or not, what should be some considerations for that. I'm going to share case studies from San Pasqual and Rincon. So San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians and Rincon Band of Luis Sueño Indians, both on both sides of, actually, no, they're both east and southeast of Paula. So two tribes that I'm working with microgrids on right now. And then share some funding, technical assistance, and other resources if you want to pursue a microgrid for your own community. Next slide. So in a nutshell, this would be, things don't happen in a vacuum and certainly don't happen perfectly, but this is kind of at a high level the process you would consider to do a thorough process for planning a tribal microgrid project. So first and foremost is just doing your vulnerability / resiliency / adaptations assessments and planning. You want to understand what are all the threats you have that are impacting or potentially going to impact your community from climate change, and what are the resiliency strategies and adaptation strategies that you can employ. Microgrids are expensive, so if you can identify strategies that are going to allow you to meet the needs from those impacts that are going to lead to power outages or other types of vulnerabilities where you're going to need power, then you may want to consider those instead of, or perhaps in addition to, planning a microgrid project. So then from there, if you do go through that process and identify that a microgrid is an appropriate project and solution for your community, then you're gonna phase into and start doing more detailed planning for that specific microgrid project. So determining the scope, goals, and objectives of the microgrid is an important first step. You need to determine this to identify exactly what you want your microgrid to do and how you want it to function, what facilities you want it to cover. And it's an iterative process as well. As you gather more information, find out what the costs are going to be associated with having certain capabilities and covering certain facilities, then you may need to scale it up or down. And then from there, you're going to then begin gathering information and getting cost estimates and stuff like that, and adjust that as needed. So gathering that site information, analyzing it, and that data, primarily energy data, billing data for your facilities, is going to help you identify how big of an energy load you're going to need that microgrid to serve. It's important to conduct a feasibility study and run a full preliminary analysis for the system to just ensure that it's going to work, that from an electrical and engineering standpoint, it's going to actually be possible, and then from an economic standpoint, that it's going to be possible as well. And even just locationally, you may have a series of facilities that you want to have covered, but they may not be in close enough proximity to one another. But if you run the feasibility analysis, then you'll be able to identify the cost and any other constraints you may have to identify the best possible solution. From there, if you do identify that solution, you've done the preliminary analysis. The preliminary analysis is going to involve some preliminary engineering and design, where you're going to scope out the system, identify the components, put it on a map. Then you'll start to conduct your microgrid project procurements, and you have a few different options here. I would say your two primary options are, one, to do a full procurement process where you develop an RFP and you put it out to bid, and then you get competing bids for the project. That can be costly and time consuming. It certainly can likely lead to the best possible system, but you may have a group or design build contractor that you want to work with, and you can just maybe skip to trying to work with that one, or you can try to work with just a select few and help them, work with them to do the design engineering, and then see what that looks like before you actually, you could hire a company to do the design and engineering first, and then you could actually then hire somebody to do the design build. Maybe it's the same company, maybe it's not, or you could just work with somebody you want and do sole source if your procurement processes allow that. And then from there, you're going to have selected that firm who's going to construct the system for you, and they're going to do they're going to finalize the design engineering. They're going to do the construction, the commissioning of the microgrid, and then it'll be activated. These projects, depending on how big they are, they could take anywhere from, if you're really lucky, and depending on the interconnection requirements of your jurisdiction or your utility, it could take maybe as little as 6 months, but you're probably looking at anywhere from 9 months to 12 months to, as long as 2 years potentially, just depending on what you find. Environmental may come into play as well. What are the environmental considerations, environmental impact reports and studies, all that is. And then once you complete the project, it's fully commissioned, you've gotten the green light to interconnect if you're going to have a grid connected system. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then you're going to have your functional microgrid system. Then you're going to be operating and doing your ongoing operations and maintenance for the system. And various components going to last, likely, solar. If your microgrid has solar, that's something that could last 20 or 30 years. If you have batteries, you're looking at something that maybe 10 to 15 years. If you have generators, whatever the lifetime of your generators are going to be. Next slide. Okay, so let's, step back. Maybe this would have been a better slide before talking about planning a microgrid, but what is a microgrid? So microgrid is a group of interconnected loads. And when I talk about a load, I mean something that's using energy. So you're in a building right now, it has a meter, it has lights, it has likely heating, ventilation, air conditioning. Some of those things may or may not be connected to electricity, but you have a series of electrical loads at a facility, at a particular location. So a group of interconnected loads, typically more than one, and distributed energy resources. Distributed energy resources are resources that are going to serve those loads. So we're talking about things like solar, like generators, like wind power, batteries. It could be one or more of these things, but anything that can seek to serve those loads. And so these interconnected loads and these distributed energy resources are in a clearly defined electrical boundary and can be controlled as a single entity. So you have a series of buildings. Let's say you have a tribal government complex that includes a tribal hall, a fire station, and maybe a wastewater treatment plant or a groundwater pump. So let's say you have those three facilities. Those are all become those are all connected electrically and all connected to those distributed energy resources, your solar, and then they have some controls that are associated with that as well. And you can control where that solar, those battery power resources, where the electricity from those gets distributed among those three electrical loads. And so they are a single controllable entity with respect to the grid if it is a grid connected system, and they can be decoupled from the grid. So a microgrid can connect and disconnect from the grid to enable it to operate in both, they call it grid connected mode or island mode, or, so island mode is when you're not off the grid. So if the power goes out, then your system goes into island mode, and that means you continue to have power for those facilities using those distributed energy resources that'll continue to operate autonomously until either your fuel runs out from those resources or until the grid comes back on and your loads then reconnect to the grid. So I talked about some of the components and technologies, the loads themselves, the electrical loads that you're serving, the technologies. Talked about wind, solar, hydro, biomass, various sources of energy that can be generated locally nearby on site and connected directly to those loads, as opposed to being on a grid where you have a power plant that's located perhaps hundreds of miles or more away from the electrical load that it's serving and has to transmit that electricity through the grid in order to get to that facility. So these are ones that are directly connected to the facility, so that if the grid goes down, they're going to continue to be able to apply electricity to them. And so I'll get into the applications throughout this presentation and in the case studies. Next slide. So just to kind of just show you graphically what I was talking about. As I mentioned, on the left side, there's a utility grid that may or may not be applicable. You can have a microgrid that isn't connected. So you may be at some facilities that don't actually they're not connected to an electric grid right now. Let's say you're running facilities right now that have generators that are going 24/7. You could set up a microgrid where you could have multiple facilities be part of a system rather than functioning independently. So let's say instead of having your tribal hall just have its own generator, your fire station have its own generator, and your water pump having its own generator. A microgrid simply could be connecting all three of those systems to a single generator, and they're not connected to the grid because you don't have grid access right there. But let's say, normally those are connected to the grid, then that would be applicable to you. And then you would still connect them electrically. They would just be able to decouple them from the grid as needed. So the kind of rounded rectangle things to the right, your generator, your renewables, your storage, those are your distributed energy resources. And those are just examples. You don't have to have a generator. You don't have to have renewables. You don't have to have storage, but you do need to have at least some of these things in order to allow you to function autonomously or off of the grid. And then the dotted round rectangle is the loads, electrical loads that you're serving. PCC stands for point of common coupling. So that's just representing that all those things to the right are interconnected together. And then you will have some controls typically near or at the point of common coupling that are going to allow you to control how those resources get distributed to those loads and also allow you to decouple from the grid. Next slide, please. So some examples of threats, impacts, and strategies that you may want to consider. First of all, threats that may lead to you wanting to consider microgrid are extreme heat. You may be experiencing, as a result of extreme heat, it's very hot in the summer where you're at, and your utility doesn't have the resources to meet that demand. They may have some rolling brownouts where you're losing power for a period of time. You may experience extreme events. So storms may knock out power lines and poles nearby, and you may just lose power until they reconnect your power. The utility comes out and does that. Wildfire is pretty typical here out in California, and that could burn, they can knock down some lines, or they could also be de-energizing those lines due to high winds. So what's happening in California right now are called public safety power shutoff events. And what they're doing is when the winds are starting to get really high, they are actually de-energizing the lines, because what's happening is as the winds are hitting those lines, it's creating sparks that are leading to wildfires. So utilities like San Diego Gas and Electric, where Paula, Rincon, and San Pasqual are located at, when it's high heat and high wind events in these areas where there's a lot of fuels, so a lot of forested areas, they are de-energizing the lines to avoid leading to wildfires. So, that's kind of, I guess, ironic, is, Paula was losing power because of wildfires before, because the lines were getting knocked down because of the wildfires or because of the winds, but now they're actually just de-energizing the lines to prevent the wildfires from even occurring in the first place. And then you're getting large swaths of these IOU territories, or these utility territories, that are losing power, even though there's not actually a wildfire going on. So some of the impacts you may be experiencing, and there's certainly more threats than just those that may be leading to power outages. The impacts you may be experiencing are, you may have health facilities and services that are available to your community that you need to continue to be able to serve. If there's a wildfire going on, or if there's a storm event, people are losing power at their homes. You may have people who need power in order to power medical devices. You need those health facilities and services to be available, both at a community level and perhaps at an individual home level. Emergency response services, your public safety, your emergency response personnel, your fire departments may need power to continue to function. You may have shelters and cooling centers that are you need people to be able to go to if they lose the power, or if they lose their home, but God forbid. And then if it's extreme heat, for them to go to cool off. And that's in the case of evacuation or relocation. And then there are also water and wastewater systems. Certainly water is something that you can't go very long without. Wastewater, you may be able to go a bit longer, but if it's multi-days, then things start to back up, and you certainly want those systems to be available. So these are just examples of impacts that you may be experiencing in your community as a result of or may experience in your community as a result of these threats to your power supplies. So some potential strategies you may want to consider are the local power and or fuel, and this could just be a single facility system, like a backup generator that's attached to your facility. It could be diesel, it could be propane, it could be natural gas, or you could just have a battery backup system. That's actually something that's being funded in California right now. I'll get to that more in a moment. But having that single facility system, and that includes backup generators. But if you have multiple facilities that are located in an area close by to one another that can be electrically, maybe already are or could be electrically combined, then you may want to consider a microgrid system. And that's really the focus of this presentation. Next slide. So some questions you may want to ask to consider whether you need a microgrid is, what are your power supply threats? We talked about some of those already. Do you experience outages, or do you expect to experience outages? If you don't have power supply threats and you don't regularly experience outages, then you may not need a microgrid. But if you do experience outages, well, how long and how frequent are your outages? If you just experience periodic outages that are lasting, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, maybe an hour, and that's kind of the extent of your outages, then a microgrid system is, maybe an expense that you don't want or need to incur. But if you're like Paula, or maybe not Paula so much, because you're kind of at the beginning of a grid or right near a peaker plant, but Rincon and San Pasqual have been experiencing multi-day outages. And so they're losing all of their facilities across the reservation for multiple days. Tribes up Northern California, I think we're out for a week or two, I want to say last November or so, because of the PSPS outages. How long and how frequent are those outages will dictate whether or not you need a microgrid. And then, if you are finding that you do experience frequent and long outages and or long outages, what are the facilities that are essential or critical that need power during those outages? So you need to identify those, get the data for those. How much power do they need? Do they already have backup power? Do they have a generator attached to them? Is that generator sufficient? Do you have sufficient fuel for that generator? So what is the capacity and duration of that backup power? Can that backup power you have right now get you through enough of the outage? And is it meeting the power outage need that you have right now? Next slide. So I want to share some case studies to make this more real. So the first one I'm going to share is the San Pasqual Government Complex Microgrid Project, which is we are in the design engineering phase, nearing the completion of the first, nearing the completion of the engineering design, and hopefully this will be live within the next 6 months. Next slide. So here's the San Pasqual Reservation, and they have a bit of a checkerboard going on here. They have trust lands and fee lands. I should have put on the map here where exactly the project was located, but as I mentioned, this is southeast of Paula, about 20 minutes or so, I think. Next slide. Just like Paula, just like Rincon, San Pasqual is threatened and experiences wildfires on a regular basis. So this map just is an overlay of some of the recent fires they've experienced in the past 20 years. I don't think this actually includes some of the most recent fires, but it was a pretty handy map. Next slide. So San Pasqual has gone through some aspects of the vulnerability planning process, and we did this as we were planning this project as well. The threats they have to power outages are certainly wildfires, and there were some examples that were taken from those maps. High winds, de-energization are something they've been experiencing regularly. They experience they're getting more and more extreme storms that are happening during the wintertime. So they're getting, it seems like, less frequent rain, but more intense rain when they get it. There can be planned outages, and also just somebody hitting a pole can lead to multi-hour power outage. So some impacts, this is actually a little data. They had a 20+ outage in 2017. They've actually had day-long outages pretty much every single year. They haven't had one yet in 2020, but they had in 2019 and 2020. I don't recall if they've had one in 2018. But this is leading to lost productivity and revenues for on their commercial side of operations, and even on the government side of operations. Equipment can be damaged, and they're just inability to use facilities. So all those services that they need available to their community are now not available to them, including the alternative purposes. So in some cases, their government center is serving as an evacuation shelter, and so that's not really available, at least with power. Next slide. The leadership of San Pasqual took some time to consider what their goals were for the microgrid project, and their primary goal was resilience. They were experiencing these day-long plus outages, and they wanted to be able to maintain electrical power for their essential government operations. A secondary goal for this project was economic. So they wanted to be able to reduce electricity costs. So you want to talk to these goals, because if your goal is solely just resilience, then a backup generator may meet that goal alone. But if you also have an economic goal, well, a backup generator is not going to save you money. It's just going to be an added expense. But if you develop a microgrid that has solar, then that solar can continue to serve your community, serve those facilities, and save them money potentially, even when you're not in an island mode, and they'll be serving those facilities on an ongoing basis. Another goal of San Pasqual, two other goals were environmental. They wanted to achieve 100% renewable energy, and they also wanted to reduce greenhouse gas and air pollution emissions. Next slide. So these are the facilities that are being covered by the San Pasqual microgrid project that we're working on right now. There's the government administration building, which includes their tribal hall. That's primarily there's a Red Cross certified evacuation center. It's going to be their command and control for their emergency operations. There's first aid happening there as well, and there's refrigerate food. They have a full commercial sized kitchen in there as well. The housing and security department is primarily just for the public safety department. They have some IT related stuff. There's security cameras to be able to track what's going on the reservation, set up that they access from there. The fire department is located nearby as well. That provides that essential service. They also have 911 emergency dispatch and a series of handheld radios. The education buildings, the main education, the preschool buildings are public shelters that are going to cater more to families. And there's also a small wastewater treatment plant on site serving the complex. So these are all the facilities that are within the scope of the microgrid system that we're currently working on. Next slide, please. So here is the initial conceptual design. This was included as part of the RFP we issued for this project. And this microgrid includes some existing solar. So down near the numbers 5 and 6, those are actually representing meters. There's small little things that you can actually see there's some solar on there already. In the upper left corner, the blue solar panels are going to be new solar that's going to be installed. I want to say it's a 147 kilowatt system. Be integrated in the system. There's going to be a backup. There's going to be a propane generator that's going to be integrated within the microgrid system, and also a battery energy storage system, lithium-ion battery energy storage system that's going to be part of the system. There's already an existing propane tank. So as you're developing these systems, you want to consider what resources do you have already. There's a propane tank, a 500-gallon propane tank that's available right now for the kitchen at the tribal hall. What we're doing is we're adding an additional 500-gallon propane tank, and we're piping them together. So now we have a combined 1,000 gallons of propane available for that propane generator. And that the propane generator is more of a backup. So there's some redundancy here. The solar and the primary resources that are going to serve the facilities during an outage are going to be the solar and the batteries. But the batteries may be drained. The solar may be night. It may be insufficient at that time. So we have the propane generators to be able to kick on to be able to serve any load that can't be served by the solar and batteries during that time. And so right now, the 1 through 8, the different blue circles on here are separate meters. So these buildings are not connected, and the lines, the yellow and orange lines, represent the interconnection or the combining electrical. The wiring of these facilities together so that they are going to be a single controllable entity. And then there's going to be a common point of coupling, or the point of interconnection, and that's in the bottom left. That may or may not be at that exact location, but that's where some of the current utility lines are. So it'll be connected to the grid. It'll function when it's on grid mode. The solar and the storage are going to serve the facilities. They're going to reduce demand. Demand charges they're going to offset electricity charges, and then when the grid goes down, the system actually is going to have what's called a black start. There's going to be a temporary outage that's going to last probably a few seconds, and then the microgrid system is going to engage, and the facilities are going to receive power again. So another consideration too is you can get a system that's has a seamless transition, that if the power goes out, that the system kicks on automatically without any outage, even of a few seconds, but those can be expensive. And so if you don't want to incur that expense and you can afford to have a brief outage, then what you can do is you can add UPS, uninterruptible power supply units throughout these buildings on critical servers, computers, and stuff like that. So at least those computers and servers don't lose power, and those usually will have a 30-minute capacity or so. And those will allow you to weather that brief outage before your microgrid system kicks on. Next slide, please. So I got into more detail on the Sampa Squall project. We are further along. I'm working on several microgrids for the Rincon Band of Los Sueños Indians right now, and I just want to share so you can see some other use cases for those as well. Next slide. All right, so this is the biggest one we're working on right now, and recently got updated. We were able to secure, well, stepping back, Sampa Squall project was funded by a DOE grant of about $700,000 plus a Grid Alternatives grant of $150,000 in addition to tribal funding for that project. The whole total project cost, I think, is in the range of $1.5 to $1.8 million on that system. This is a fairly large microgrid system, a very complex one. We've been able to secure approximately $8 or $9 million for this through various sources. Most recently, we've gotten additional funding for some more emerging energy storage technologies called flow batteries and flywheel energy storage systems. But this is going to serve the Harrah's Rincon Resort Casino. It's also going to serve the wastewater treatment plant. There's a gaming building that's to the north in between the wastewater treatment plant and the casino. And then to the south, there is a travel plaza that includes a gas station and convenience store that's going to be part of the microgrid as well. So these systems right now are not fully electrically connected. They will be. There are, I believe, 8 meters on site, 8 or 9 meters, and be connected throughout this campus. There's already 1 megawatt of solar. We're going to integrate that into serve all of these facilities. We're going to add 2 additional megawatts of solar. There's going to be over 10 megawatt hours of battery storage, which is very significant. That can actually by itself keep these facilities online for likely a day or more. And then there are 2 megawatts of existing diesel generation on site. We're going to add an additional megawatt of generation to that. They're going to be fully integrated with microgrid controls at a common point of coupling, and it'll be a grid-tied system so that it's going to function on the grid. And when there's an outage, it's going to go off, going to go seamlessly into island mode, so these facilities can continue to operate. This is a critical facility to Rincon. This is their main economic driver of their community. And they've experienced over the past few years, day-plus long outages. And when their casino goes down, we're talking, $1 million or so more in lost revenues. So it's very significant. And so this is a very worthwhile investment for them. They are very motivated to install the system and get this funding. So we are in the planning processes right now. We're initiating the procurement to get this system going and installed. Next slide. There's going to be a separate microgrid installed at their fire station, a much smaller, more simple system, 100 kilowatt solar PV system, roughly 132 kilowatt hour battery system with microgrid controls. That'll also be connected to a diesel generator, and that'll also be a grid connected system. Next slide. And then we also recently received $1 million for a DOE grant for a microgrid at their tribal government center. And this is going to include over 200 kilowatts of new solar, a combination of carport solar and rooftop solar. It's going to integrate their existing diesel generator they have on site with a battery backup system, and it'll be fully integrated with controls and another grid-tied system. Next slide. Sorry. All right, so this is going to be the last slide, and I'll take some questions after this. I think I've seen a few pop up already, but I wanted to get to these slides, and we'll have about 10 minutes or so. So I want to share some of the funding, technical resources, and other resources technical assistance and other resources you may have to pursue these types of projects. I think first and foremost is the Department of Energy Tribal Energy Program grants. They tend to have annual cycles. This year they actually had 2. I think there's a deadline coming up in July. So if you are interested and can meet the match requirements for this, they're typically a 50% cost share or 1-to-1 match on these projects. I think they do have some hardship waivers potentially on these projects as well. You could get up to, I think, $2 million through the Department of Energy for a microgrid project. And if you're talking about a government scale project, that likely will be sufficient. If you're talking about a large casino type project or other large economic venture type system that has a large electrical load, then it'll get you started. It may help you install, some basic capacity. With the Rincon project, we initially got a $2 million DOE grant, and the purpose was to install the backbone of the microgrid. So we were electrically integrating all the facilities, adding the 2 megawatts of solar. The Rincon was kicking in an additional $5 million themselves because it made sense for them to invest in the solar above just getting the funding to install the microgrid system and some a little more diesel generation, a little more battery backup. But we saw California Energy Commission opportunity for a significant amount of energy storage that we pursued, and that's what we got the $7 million plus on that, or that's what they really needed to be fully autonomous. So sometimes you have to do this in phases, and that's what the idea was there. We got the DOE grant to start the phase 1, and the CEC grant is really the phase 2 and completes the microgrid system. They'll continue to pursue other energy options. One thing you also do want to consider too is, in addition to pursuing resources to allow you to stay online during an outage, you also want to consider how can you reduce your electrical load. So are there things you can do on site to reduce the energy demand? Can you install a more efficient HVAC system that's going to use less energy? Because if you can do that, then you're going to need less solar, less batteries, less other resources to keep your systems online. So you always want to reduce your loads, reduce your demand first before you start adding these resources to the extent possible, to the extent that it's cost effective. DOE also offers technical assistance for free. I believe they offer up to 40 hours of technical assistance. They have folks at NREL and other labs that can support you in conducting feasibility studies for these types of projects. I believe both DOE and the BIA have loan guarantee programs, so you could get loans to install these systems. So if the tribe doesn't want to just shell out cash for it, pursue financing, and it can work with the DOE or BIA to get loan guarantees, which could make it easier to get financing and buy down some of the interest. The BIA has their energy and minerals development planning grants that you can use to conduct feasibility studies and other project planning for microgrid systems, and we've been doing some of that with Paula. BIA offers technical assistance. I've never taken advantage of that before, but you can reach out to them for some assistance in conducting feasibility studies and doing project planning. And I mentioned California Energy Commission grant that we've received and that we've pursued for various projects. If you are in California, a very timely opportunity right now is the self-generation incentive program. There are rebates that can cover up to 100% of the cost of battery systems for essential and critical facilities. We've been working with Paula, San Pasqual, and Rincon so far, and we're launching a statewide initiative to get as much of this funding as possible. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that just got released at the beginning of May, but it's going really fast. I'm actually not anticipating it to be available any longer. It's probably going to be a matter of months before it's entirely exhausted. So we're trying to, and it's available to not just tribal entities, but other entities, government entities, and even business entities throughout the state. We're trying to get as many free tribal battery backup systems as possible installed at various facilities. If you want to learn more and you're interested, you can use that link or contact me afterwards on that. And then there's other grants you may want to consider as well. FEMA has grants for resilience and for emergency response that can potentially fund these types of systems. Bureau of Reclamation may allow you to get funding to get backup systems or microgrid systems that are going to serve water facilities if you're in the Bureau of Reclamation territory. If you're in California, Cal OES, the Emergency Service Department. Can't remember what the acronym stands for. Has grants that may be available. Thank you, Shasta. USDA maybe has grants and loans and TA that may be able to support those. I never used any of those on my own, but so just to get you started, I think there's other ones out there. Try to be creative. So one thing to consider too is that, with FEMA, they have funding available for emergency response. You may not think microgrid, but if it's a critical need and you can justify it, you may be able to get funding to keep those facilities online. So sometimes you get creative and use funding that may not be on its face available for a microgrid system. All right, so let me look at some of the questions. We have about 7 minutes left on this. Going the wrong way. So the slides will be made available.
About the slides, yes, and the slides will be sent. They'll be attached to the rest of the today's presentation. So actually,
Somebody accidentally pushed the question button.
I have a question which I had never considered before, since we have so much solar capability here. But do you know if microgrids can be used with wind energy systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any local energy source, whether it's, you may have a biomass energy generation facility, you could have a cogen plant that's using a fuel source such as natural gas or hydrogen. any fuel source that you can develop and install locally enough that you can directly connect it to your systems is available. So any type of generator, but if you want to get away from fossil fuels, then you'll be considering sources like wind and solar. On these projects, because these are critical facilities, we have, and because we're primarily relying upon solar, solar's not always available, wind's not always available. You don't necessarily have a constant fuel source. So that's why we have backup generators that are also available to meet the load to the extent that the solar or wind could not. If you have a biomass facility, though, and you have that fuel available to you and you have an abundant supply, then you may not need that backup generator. At the same time, you may want redundancy. If your biomass facility is down for maintenance at the time during an outage, well, you're not going to have power. So if you have a backup generator, backup diesel, or propane generator, then that's going to allow those facilities to stay online.
All right. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure. So again, if you have any questions, we got a few minutes and you can ask. It's a lot of information, but it's really a good, worthwhile option to consider, even if it's one of those long-term adaptation strategies that you decide to pursue. If there's so many different things to consider with this, it's not just the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also resilience in all sorts of different disasters. And of course, for California, wildfire is a big one, but I know that's true in Eastern Oregon and Washington and Montana and Idaho, in a lot of places. So definitely something to consider as technology to help you with your adaptation. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, which you guys are amazing. You just absorbed all of that and we're like, okay, I'm an expert now.
If you want, I'll be presenting probably a similar presentation at the Tribal Lands and Environment Forum coming up in August as well, and that one I think will be available on demand. So it's a lot to absorb, and I recommend too, you want to work with experts on these things as well, and so take advantage of some of those free resources. The Department of Energy, the BIA, they can certainly get you started. And I was in your shoes. I was director of the San Ynez Chumash Environmental Department. I was just cutting my teeth, learning all those things with them, and it took me a lot of time to kind of get up to speed on these things. I had to work through a lot of solar projects, other energy projects, and learn about these technologies, which are continuing to emerge and evolve. So I'm, enjoying being on the cutting edge of these things, and I'm enjoying kind of doing some innovative projects with these tribal communities. But it's a lot. So, certainly find people to help you. I do see two more questions coming up. So how challenging is it to utilize wind turbines and wind power, especially in places like the Great Plains? So that's, going to be very location specific. Certainly it depends on what the wind resource is available at your particular location. What you would want to do to consider whether or not wind is a feasible option for microgrid, or even, you don't need to have a microgrid to do wind. You could just have it be a renewable energy resource that's available to you as well without having it provide backup capabilities. The first step is going to be to get somebody to bring an anemometer out there or do some type of wind study to see how consistent of wind you have. And they'll run a feasibility analysis on there. And then also the terrain, is it flat? Is it mountainous? How close can you site those wind turbines to the facilities that they're going to serve? And what are the environmental impacts and concerns associated with that as well? So I would start with it seems like you can go on I believe Department of Energy NREL websites have wind resource maps where you can enter your address, your GPS coordinates, and it'll tell you what roughly what the wind resources are in those locations. And then if it looks like there are potentially some viable wind resources, then go and try to work with the Department of Energy or NREL or any other experts, maybe some local universities may be willing to support you in doing some preliminary studies to see whether you have a project there and what it's going to cost, and identify what some of the funding resources could be.
All right, and that takes us to our last minute. So I answered Paula's question. She wanted to know the location and information on your TLEF presentation in August, and that's going to be virtual because of the pandemic. I don't think they've scheduled the exact times yet, but I can make that information available when it does come out. So I want to thank Josh for spending some time with us today, and for combing your hair before the presentation. Looks good.
Thank you.
And again, if you have any questions for Josh, you can email him or email me, and I'll make sure that he gets those questions. Oh, and Erin says, thank you for the presentation. Congratulations on the new baby. So,
Thank you.
All right.
We're getting sleep while we can.
Thanks, Josh. And just wrapping up, we are right at 11:30. So on our last slide here, I am just showing our suggested reading before our next webinar, which will be on July 21st. And I believe that's going to be just me again. So I'll make sure to get another haircut before then. And I will send out everybody the slides and the video link and all the usual stuff within the next couple of hours, or definitely by tomorrow morning. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great day, and look forward to talking to you by email and seeing you in July.
Take care, everyone.